If you bet the NFL, or you have any interest in the NFL or fantasy with the NFL, or even if you don't have any interest in the NFL, you're going to find value in this video. This is going to be an awesome video. We're following up two previous ones with Paul Stone and with Brad Powers, and we are back, but this time it's NFL, and one of the very best in the industry is going to join us this time. There's no time to waste. We're on a time constraint. I have no time to introduce Ron from Ron A Sports, and the person that needs no introduction, Warren Sharp, is here. How you doing, Warren?
I'm doing great, Chris. Happy to join you guys. Love talking about the NFL and previewing the season with you.
I appreciate the conciseness there. What I need to tell everybody here is that we don't sell anything. And it's important for people to know that. But I'm going to discuss your project, which is just a massive undertaking. And I emailed you last night that I consider it literally a work of art. And this isn't a sales pitch by any means, because, you know, if you drive a car, you need gas, okay? And if you bet the NFL, you need something like this. This has everything you could possibly want to know about each team. There's 16 pages devoted to each team. And when you open this and you look at it in the very beginning, the articles at the beginning are just fascinating, discussing the defensive adjustments under short yardage positions, the scoring differentials over the last few years, the road team trends, offensive penalties and penalties in general, TDs and punt rate, and sacks. These are all very important issues that need to be discussed. And if I'm being long-winded about this, I'm sorry. This is something that has so much content in it. It really is remarkable. Warren, a quick explanation of the process involved in creating what I call the Bible. What additions or subtractions have you made from last year? And what do you believe is the best way for the average bettor to attack your team pages? Because they can be overwhelming. And what do you like the most about your team pages?
This is a great question, and I really appreciate the introduction, Chris. Obviously, this is the finality of months of work. So basically, the best thing that people should know is, in my opinion, it's the fastest way to get smart for the season. And you might think that 564 pages is not going to be fast whatsoever. But I would encourage people that are listening, don't get overwhelmed or intimidated by the total page count, because we do walk through every single team, and each team, like you said, is only 16 pages, and there's not that much. There's a lot of written work in here, but there's also statistics and data and charts and tables that occupy some of those 16 pages. So first and foremost, it is for the visualized learner. That's one of the things that was very important to me for putting a book like this together, is that most people in today's era of understanding any type of information are far more attracted to visualized data than they are to like reading and processing long black and white pages of just written word. So we try to incorporate a lot of colors and visualized data into this. What basically made things longer than it was last year, and what enhanced kind of the book this year, and last year's book was 450 pages. This year's book is 564. Why the increase? It was primarily because I'm buying more data. I'm spending over $20,000 more to acquire new data than what I had last year. And I was spending significant money on data last year and the year before. So I'm buying new charting data and other types of information that I never had before that help me understand the game better. And that's what I think when you mentioned at the top, fantasy or betting or just NFL analysis, if you understand football and you understand the way to win games based on the current rules constructs, what is the optimal ways to win football games, period. And then you figure that out, you will be better at betting on the game itself, because you'll understand the fastest path to victory. You'll understand what these teams need to do. Do they have the right people, coaches, players, schemes to play football in the way that it's intended to be played with the current rules. And when you understand what teams are doing, that's going to help you when you're trying to bet on these games or pick the right fantasy players. And so it's longer because I have more access to data, and the process itself of pulling it together is very simple, quite frankly. I start at the beginning. Last year, there were 32 teams with a goal. They had varying goals. Some wanted to win the division. Some wanted to, do X, Y, or Z. But at the end of the day, 31 of these teams did not win a Super Bowl. Why not? What happened to these teams last year? What were they doing wrong? Did they not have the right coaches? Were the coaches calling the wrong plays? Did they not have the right players? Were they having too many injuries? Were they turning the ball over too much? Was their performance in high leverage situations like third downs or inside the red zone bad? Did they miss too many field goals? Did their opponent make too many field goals that they weren't supposed to make? Did they lose too many one-score games? So I look at all of these different things. Why did they not get to the ultimate goal of winning a Super Bowl? And 31 teams did not. So I analyze that. And then I say, what has changed this year? Obviously, coaches change the beginning of January once the season ends. Then you have free agency in March. Then you have the draft. And then you add more players via free agency potentially. So everything that's changed now, what do I think these coaches are going to call this year? And how do I think these teams are going to perform? So I do that for 32 different teams. I take that same approach. And that's why when you're reading each chapter, it's actually easy. It's a story in and of itself of this team, what they were doing last year, why it didn't work, what I think that they're going to try to do this year, and then do I think that that will work? And there's multiple things that you're going to learn about every single team that you did not know before you open this book, because that's what I tried to do, is share some of the detailed things that you're not going to find regurgitated everywhere else. And when you have that information, I think it will help you understand these teams better for this upcoming season.
Well, as you've noticed, I'm still scrolling just one team to show people just the sheer volume of stuff in here. And as you mentioned, the colors and the graphs and the way that it's laid out make it so much easier to read. Because if this was, a few years ago and you're just looking at just paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, it gets boring. So there's something for everybody in this. Well, I call it the Bible. And this isn't a sales pitch. This is just something. It's like gas for your car. It's a reference that I think fantasy players and bettors can really value from. And it's just a lot of different ways to quick reference these topics. It sounds to me like you answered my next question of what you like the most is what the time you've spent in to make it colorful and easy to read. I'd like to go off of this subject and ask you, there's been a lot of moving parts over the last few years with COVID, with coaching changes, with the way penalties are called, all kinds of things. What changes have you made to your own handicapping over just the recent few years that you think are going to stick with you?
Well, that's an important qualifier that you put at the end there, because there were definite changes that I made during that COVID year. And then there were definite changes that I made at the beginning of last season. And those are not going to be sticking with me. During the COVID off season, we attacked betting overs harder than we've ever done in the past and had so much success doing that. The lack of crowd noise and the lack of refs calling penalties really helped those road offenses produce better, score more in the red zone. And I know Rich wrote a little bit about that, about scoring following up the hot 2021 and how that followed the highest scoring season in league history, which was the season that we had COVID. Last year, then, we looked at doing the opposite. We were betting a lot of the unders, particularly early on in the season, and had a ton of success doing that, as people still had the impressions, as did bookmakers, as did bettors, that we were going to see a lot of scoring. And now you have the fans back in the stands, and that adds an element of difficulty for those road teams and sometimes even for the home teams to operate in. But this year, we're not going to have either of those benefits, right? There's no real easy, low-hanging fruit that we can grab and really provide an edge. So it's back to I think for me is trying to figure out on a week-to-week basis who I'm going to attack. But there are certain teams that I think have edges this year based upon coaching. So one of the things you asked, like, what will I carry forward? I think over the last couple of years, I've put more emphasis on better understanding coaching and which coaches are more likely to make optimal decisions as frequently as possible in games, and moving some of the bad coaches out and replacing them with some of the good coaches, I think will make a world of difference. I think a quarterback who played with a bad coach who now is on a team that is calling plays more effectively, that quarterback ceiling will get raised as well, as will his floor. So coaching is so paramount. And then we've also seen a very interesting thing that plays into the coaching. But that's the first article in the book, which is why these guys were writing about these types of things. The defenses that are more likely to sit back, play the too high shell, invite the run, especially against Patrick Mahomes, especially against Josh Allen, teams that pass the ball a ton with a really good quarterback. These defenses will much rather have that quarterback turn his back to them and hand the ball off to a running back to try to gain 4.5 yards than they would those quarterbacks dropping back to pass, finding their weak points and the ability with the arm talent to throw the ball anywhere that they want to on the field and do that more frequently on early down. So I think it's going to be interesting how the coaching chooses to attack the defenses that are playing less aggressive, that are inviting the run looks a little bit more. And, you know, I think it's great that the Chiefs had all off season to see what happened last year and to try to make some adjustments this off season to be better prepared, because they obviously went through a big transition period last year where they weren't quite sure what they were going to do in some of those situations. And then there's teams that can make the adjustments on the fly. If you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, for example, I wrote about this in the Eagles chapter, but they were an offense last season through the first 6 weeks. They were one of the, I think they were top 2 in early down pass rate in the first 3 quarters of games. And Jalen Hurts was actually great when he threw the ball on first down. Why is that? Because defenses didn't know if it was going to be pass or run. But on second and third downs at the beginning part of the season, with their high pass rate and the need to pass in general on second and third down, he was terrible. And what the teams were doing is they started to flood the zones, drop back, not stick as many defenders in the box. And as a result, only 2 other quarterbacks faced a higher percentage of light boxes on early downs than did Jalen Hurts. It was Patrick Mahomes with the Chiefs, and it was Josh Allen with the Bills. Jalen Hurts doesn't deserve to be in a conversation with either of those 2 quarterbacks. And yet the Eagles, because of their pass rate, were getting so many light boxes. So what they decided to do after they played the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which I think was week 7, is all of a sudden they went to the run big time.
After the bye, yeah.
After they lost to the Raiders, and then but they went to the run in that game. And then they came back and they started having a lot more success down the stretch running the football. So that's one of the things that's going to be really interesting, is how many of these defenses try to utilize some of these principles against really good quarterbacks. And then what do the offensive minded coaches try to do to counteract that and bring back the advantage to their offense?
I think Ron is going to spontaneously combust if we don't go to him immediately. You touched on at least 3 or 4 issues that we've discussed previously.
Yeah. You know, I had a question all lined up, and now I only have like 7 questions in my head. So can I ask them all at once, and then you just have to rapid fire response? I think the general observation is how much, no matter how proficient and how detail oriented, you know, somebody like you are, Warren, that you're always growing, you're always evolving, you're always trying to get to that next step. So the first of so many follow-up questions that I would have would be, you know, just take the number of 4th down tries that we've had recently. You know, people are going on 4th down instead of kicking field goals. They're going on 4th and 5 and 6, and they never used to do that in the past. We're getting much more aggressive in terms of that, and in terms of 2-point tries at the end of games. How is that factored into your handicapping and your evolution in terms of how coaches are using analytics, so you have to adjust?
No doubt about it. There are certain coaches that are better at it. And we have a page at the beginning of the book. It's a printed page, number 26 at the bottom there, that talks about strategic coaching markers. And I've went down and I've looked at the fourth down tendencies of these various different coaches over the league. And it factors in a little bit of decision-making on fourth downs in 2020. And then like 75 to 80% of it is isolated just to last year. But I didn't want to only look at last season. And there are guys that are more likely to go for it on fourth downs, and it does factor into your handicapping. It has to. I mean, there are teams when, like I remember even a couple of years ago with the Philadelphia Eagles, Doug Peterson, you guys remember like during their Super Bowl run and the years immediately after that when they weren't quite as good, he had a tendency to go for it on fourth down in his own area, especially when he was trailing. And so what that might do is open up the margin in the game a little bit more, such that you're close, but normally you would punt and try to play good defense. And so you might be able to get the ball back because the other team in the second half might be a little bit more conservative on offense. So you could try to keep it closer to losing by 6 or 7 points in that game. But if you then are down by a touchdown and you decide to go for it on 4th and 3 at your own 30-yard line because that's your strategy, even though there's 9 minutes left in the game and you just want to try to get back into it. Well, now you're giving the other team probably at least 3 points. And so trying to look at some of those margins and the point spreads as well as the totals with teams that tend to go for it more frequently, if you don't project them to be having success in that game and potentially having a lead, could impact their ability to just simply cover the spread. And they could go from a team that could win to now they lose by double digits because of their aggressive nature on fourth down. The 2-point conversions, mainly for me, at least it factored into, which numbers are the most key and what percentage drop off from the hit rate on some of those numbers will occur. And so you factor that into, how much points are worth and things of that nature from a handicapping perspective. But we really haven't seen, at least from my point of view, enough of that to really make me say, okay, I'm going to look at this team differently because they might go for it on 2 points, but the fourth downs 100%.
Okay. You touched already on the coaches, so I want to veer off to that because there were 2 points I want to make about new coaches. One is with Philadelphia, your example, having that early bye week for new coaches has always been something very important to me so that they can make adjustments. Otherwise, the season flies by. And I think your example of how Philadelphia became very run-centric is essential to the point. But the other one is we've got 9 new coaches now. And at least 3 of the teams have gone from an offensive-minded coach, particularly New Orleans and Sean Payton with his wizardry going to their defensive man, and Tampa with the no risk it, no biscuit, Bruce Arians going the other way. And then you got Miami, adapting a Shanahan approach. How do you deal with those teams with it could be a fascinating change in the way that they attack the football from 21 to 2022?
Yeah. So with the Saints in particular, this one is quite perplexing to me. There is another team where the quarterback and the coach has changed, and that's in Denver, where you went from Vic Fangio to Russell to now you have Russell Wilson instead of Drew Lock, and you have a new head coach in there. That one has even more question marks, like how quickly is he going to pick up the system? And he's a new quarterback and getting him away from Seattle. But sticking with the Saints first and foremost, I want to like the Saints because I know that there's openings in the NFC and I know that there's upside for this team. But my lone concern really hinges around Pete Carmichael, who's now calling plays for them. And I know he was the offensive coordinator before, but Sean Payton did basically everything for this team. And all the good that came out of that offense was from Sean Payton, not his different coordinators. And we saw a perfect example of that when we saw one of their former quarterback coaches turned coordinator in Joe Lombardi try to take a head job for Chris's team in Detroit with the Lions. And he was an abject disaster. And now he's the offense coordinator for the LA Chargers. And the Chargers completely did not know how to utilize Justin Herbert to his maximum level last season. They were utilizing him, Joe Lombardi was, with an ADOT, akin to what Drew Brees' ADOT was with the Saints in his final season when Lombardi was in New Orleans with Sean Payton. But Justin Herbert's arm strength and arm talent is a completely night and day situation. He's at the beginning of his career. Drew Brees, with his weak noodle arm, was at the twilight of his career. And for whatever reason, they're still not tweaking their game plan to optimize their quarterback. The reason why I'm using that as an example is because I just don't know what we're going to get out of Pete Carmichael, the play caller in New Orleans. Forget the game plans entering the game. What about the in-game adjustments or the flexibility? And the other thing that's interesting, I try to cut against the grain in a lot of what I do, just from a thought process perspective. It's like, okay, well, how could the Saints be good? Okay, how could Jameis actually be dominant? Some of the numbers from last year were good when he was in there, and the team was effective in certain instances. But the one interesting thing is, look at their season last year and look at how they started off the season, the first 4 weeks. He was not throwing. He had no games with more than 23 pass attempts, even in the games that they lost. And then they had a couple of games that he was still healthy where he got into the 30s. I think one of those games he threw 35 or 40 attempts and threw 4 interceptions as well. And they won a game and they lost a game. And then, of course, he got injured and was done. And an interesting little nugget that I've picked up from some of the coaches that I speak with and some third parties that talk to these coaches is, Sean Payton was reluctant to throw the football a ton with Jameis because he knew that once he ratcheted up those pass attempts into the 30s and, close to 40, that interceptions were inevitably going to come. Those were inevitable, that was going to happen. So we had to really keep him low in his attempt rate. And I'm looking at some of these teams that the Saints are going to be playing this season. When we look at who they beat last year, we know they own the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That's why they're so intriguing to me, because if they do have success against Tampa Bay and the rest of their division is not that great this year, and this is a team that could reel off a bunch of in-division wins and they don't have to do that much out of division to help try to hit their win total. But the problem is when you look at who they beat, obviously you got Green Bay and a rookie Mac Jones in the first 3 weeks of the season. After that, it was Washington, who was terrible, Seattle, who was terrible, the Jets, who were terrible, Carolina, who was terrible, and Atlanta, who were terrible. And none of those teams are able to score points. Those offenses just are not very good. And this year, I love Dennis Allen. I think he was deserving of this coaching role. I really am a big proponent of his. But when you're going up against teams like the Rams and the 49ers and the Bengals, and the Raiders can score points now, and I'm higher on the Minnesota Vikings. And if Deshaun is playing for the Browns late in the season, and the Eagles now added A.J. Brown, and you got the 49ers, and if Trey Lance is actually good there, these are offenses that are able to score points that you're going to be having to go up against. Jameis may have to throw the ball more than 20 to 22 times in a lot of these games against teams that are able to score more. So that's a big concern. Sorry, long-winded deep dive into the Saints. What was the second team that you mentioned aside from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? Another one I wanted to touch on.
Miami.
Yeah, so Miami, I could go on. I could tell you guys for the rest of our time.
You got 1 minute on this, Warren.
It's a fascinating team to think about.
Just cut me off when I've exceeded my time, Chris, because I'm just going to start rolling. But the interesting thing about the Dolphins is their receiving core over the last couple of years was the worst in separation. They could not get open for Tua. And as a result, Tua was constantly throwing into tight windows. Devontae Parker literally ranked 141 out of 141 in separation when he was targeted last year. And over the past couple of years, it was very close to that. He's the worst receiver in the NFL. They jettisoned him. He's up with the Patriots in New England. Now they've got receivers that are going to be able to get open. And the interesting thing about the Dolphins is think about Tua over the last 2 years. I cannot believe the travesty. The number one thing you're supposed to be doing is helping a young quarterback when you draft him in the first round, have early success in his tenure and feel good and get his confidence up. And what do? They give an offense to Ryan Fitzpatrick. They brought him in, and Chan Gailey, who was like 73 years old when they brought him in. He hadn't been in coaching for several years. The only reason Brian Flores brought in Chan Gailey is because he had worked with Ryan Fitzpatrick before. Once Ryan Fitzpatrick gets sat down for Tua, that offense did not change. It was an offense built for Ryan Fitzpatrick by his old coach who hadn't been coaching for years. And after the season, Chan Gailey came out and said, I can't believe that we were starting Tua because this offense was Ryan Fitzpatrick's offense. We weren't even ready for Tua. Also, Tua had no offseason because it was a COVID offseason combined with a catastrophic hip injury. So he got very little reps in the offseason. Last year, this team, no lie, did not know who was going to be calling plays week 1, 10 days out before the season. So, these are based on my conversations with coaches. They did not know who was going to be calling those plays. They were still juggling coordinators and coaching and play calling throughout the early part of that season. So he's just been in 2 terrible situations with coaches that have not been settled or tailored game plans to him. Now he's finally going to be able to target open receivers. They're going to work up their yak. The number 1 team in yards after the catch each of the last 4 years was the San Francisco 49ers, which is where Mike McDaniel comes from. You got guys like Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. These guys are yak machines. I think they're going to have a lot more success with yak. My only question, and Ron, you teed it up, obviously, is how good is Mike McDaniel as a play caller? Because his mind is great from offense, and Kyle Shanahan raves about how smart of a coach he is. But is he able to design, to call the right plays when they need to be called? Is he going to be aggressive in the right spots where you should be aggressive? Is he going to run too much early on and not realize that it's better to throw the football on first down, keep your quarterback out of third downs, than run the ball, get forced into third down, and then ask Tua to play on third down when the defense knows that you're going to be passing the ball? So there's just so many question marks that I have with his coach. But I am higher on Tua than a lot of other people because I think he's finally going to be put into a much better situation this season.
I agree 100% with you. I've kind of there's a handful of teams in the NFL that I've kind of flip-flopped on, and I'm a fan of Tua. I think Miami's defense is good enough. With that in mind, I'm definitely looking more optimistic with Miami. Want to hit you up with some evergreen type of stuff. When it comes to preseason, in my opinion, I actually don't even bet it usually because in my opinion, it's all about information and it's keeping up on that information and getting that information fast and getting the value. How do you value the preseason, and what tips do you have for filtering the results of what's going on? How much do you actually pay attention to it and carry forward into what your opinion of these teams are going to be?
It's a great question, and it's a difficult one because everybody's going to have their own approach. My style is I spend from March until mid-July. I'm not trying to brag, but literally outworking everybody in the industry that I can so that I can issue this book. I can write this book, and I know as much about all these teams, coaches, their strategies, etc., as I will need to for the season. And then then I do dial it down a little bit. I get out there, I'm betting some futures, then I'm dialing it down. I am watching because like coaches I talk to, it's funny. They have different strategies. I will tell you one coach in particular last season just said, I'm just going to call 15 straight run plays just to call 15 straight run plays in this game. And you will get different coaches that, especially some of the guys that have been in their position for a couple of years, that are just trying new things. We want to work on the run game, so we're going to do that. And you don't know as you're betting the game. Reading is vital. If you're going to bet preseason, you have to read a ton, understand what the coaches are saying that they're going to try to do. To me, I still believe in general, I'm happy that they do it, but coaches talk too much. Coaches are so eager to get the media to write good stories about them that they reveal far too much information, even during the season at times, about some of the players that they're going to utilize more, some of their strategies or some of their ideas for the upcoming opponents. And unfortunately, that leads into the preseason where they talk a lot about who they're rotating through and all this stuff. There's no requirement that the coaches say anything about that. I would not be talking about that at all if I'm a coach and keep that all to me. You have to really pay close attention to what you read and I think focus so much on the preseason in just terms of the win-loss results that I would rather learn from what I'm picking up on, like a certain way a guy's running, a guy returning from injury, how he looks, maybe some of the way that this quarterback's looking when he's trying to throw deep, guys that I had question marks about before, new offenses and some of the plays that I see dialed up, because they're not going to run all those plays in the regular season, but they are going to try to work in a few things and concepts that they're going to introduce. So that's really what I pay attention to. I'm more like you, Chris. I mean, I don't really bet a whole lot on the preseason. What I'm trying to do is then regain as much information as I can so that I can have a really strong start to the regular season. And so I'm not trying to look and get down on small edges in the preseason. I'd rather process information, improve my decision making and my thought process about these teams so that when the limits are high and the regular season is here, I'm able to be a lot more successful.
That's exactly the way I look at it. And just building off of this quickly, what is your process to incorporate the actual data of the season versus your preseason opinion of these teams? At what point and what methodology are you dropping off your preseason opinion, whether it be 100% correct or 100% wrong? When do you pivot? How early will you pivot? And is it different for each team? What's the process with you?
I'm a little different than a lot of people out there. I don't really factor in too much of what I thought the teams were in the offseason once we get a month into the year. I'm now focusing on what you're able to do during the season, and that's literally all I'm caring about. I know there are some guys that even in like week 15 or 12 are looking at last year's stats and they're 10% of my numbers of like, I don't use any of last year's data because teams change so much in the NFL and it's a small sample size to begin with that I don't want any of that diluting what I'm using for this upcoming season. But the one key that you absolutely must focus on is strength of schedule and who you're playing, right? Like I'm not going to, in a vacuum, look at a team that, let's pretend we're talking about the New York Jets, and the New York Jets in week 5, they are the 6th best team rushing the football. But the reality, and I'm not going to say, oh, well, that's just the 6th best team because that's what the numbers show in week 5. And I'm not looking at preseason expectations and I'm not looking at last year. If they went up against the 4th easiest schedule of opposing run defenses, including 3 that rank bottom 10 on the season, I'm going to factor that into my understanding of what this Jets rushing offense is like. And especially if they're going to now play a massive step up in competition with a team that has a very good front 7 and has been top 5 in stopping the run so far this season. So I look at schedule a lot, and I also don't really try to factor in too much about my priors once we get a month or so into the season.
You and I are identical on that. I'm going to be pivoting or looking to pivot by week 4 also after the first month. You've got us on a hard stop. We got a lot of questions to go. Ron's got a special teams question. I know he's chomping the bit to send your way.
Okay, I'm going to, first of all, I agree with those last statements. All of the stations really, because you're really providing some great points to the listener. And I also pivot after 4 weeks. The elephant in the room is special teams for me. I don't think it's addressed enough. And I agree with, I read your Charger report really carefully because that's a team, according to my metrics, if you just looked at offense and defense, they would be in the playoffs 6 of the last 7 years. They're that good. Even with the play calling you mentioned with Lombardi, they were a team that if not for special teams, they would be there often. But I just can't ignore the fact that even though it's hard to quantify, that special teams has let them down year after year after year. We're talking 2 to 3 games, not just making or missing field goals, but we're talking about punt protection. We're talking about giving up punt. They just don't value getting players onto their special teams. I didn't see a lot of information put in that section regarding the Chargers and special teams. Is it just too hard to quantify, or what are your general thoughts in terms of can you assess special teams and put a number on it or do anything with it?
Well, it's a great point, and you're smart to ask. Obviously, the main things that we focus on special teams with each team chapter is primarily field goal luck, your own makes over expectations. So we obviously chart out your expected make range based on distance, and then we calculate were you making more than you expected, as well as your opponent makes. And actually, the Chargers were the worst team in the NFL last year at opponent make over expectation. Their opponents made almost 4 more field goals than they should have made, adding up the small fractions throughout the course of each game and over the course of the season. And that ranked dead last in the NFL. There's really not much you can do about that, right? Like, you just went up against some kickers that banged some against you that normally they wouldn't make. But their own kicking, as you mentioned, they were 6th worst in the NFL in terms of makes over expectation. The best strategy, I think, if you really want to try to predict special teams, is probably to look at who your special teams coordinator is, read up on whether or not there was a philosophical change as to whether or not they're going to put more key players on that unit or how they're going to address it. Because as we know in football, there's only 2 things that really make the engine go. It's who you've got from a player perspective and what you ask them to do from a coaching perspective. And so the hard part is going to be, like, unless they come out and say, here's what my philosophy is going to be with, like, if you're trying to figure out or predict the team that was bad, could they get better? You got to see if they change their coach. And then if they didn't, you got to see if there's any reading material about a different philosophy that they're going to begin to utilize. Otherwise, chances are you're not going to have a great projection preseason about the team getting better or worse on special teams. You're just going to kind of have to see how things go during the season and then factor that into your handicapping as it moves forward. And I mean, I love doing things that not as many other people do. That's why I focus so much on schedule. If you were able to focus a little bit more on special teams and incorporate that more frequently, I think that would probably help a little bit once you get a good handle on how good or bad a team is. The hard part about special teams in general, though, mine is just evaluating like the pure punter, is specifically the low volume of plays leads to higher variance because of the smaller sample size. But if you have a good feel for that, then you could have some success because not as many people are probably factoring that into their analysis as much.
I look at it as a pattern. When there's a pattern, and like you said, where there's been no changes and the pattern continues, what's to stop it from continuing on the downside or on the upside? Bill Belichick scours the nation personally to look at people to fill his special teams units. And whereas the Chargers just ranked near the bottom, the Packers blew the playoff game because they didn't pay any attention to special teams. It's really looking for outliers. In the middle, teams are going to change from 10th to 12th to 20th or vice versa. But the ones that are consistently at the bottom or the top, I just don't understand why they don't change.
And that's the thing, just real final point on this. So much of what schedule analysis or special teams analysis or some of these other things that might be factored in but don't get factored in as much, don't get too consumed by, teams that rank 12th through 22nd, right? Like, focus on those outliers that are the top 5, top 10, or bottom 5, bottom 10. If a team is a 16th worst schedule versus the 20th worst schedule, like, don't say, oh, well, the 16th one is going to be better because they don't have the 20th. Like, you can't look at it through that lens. This is not as precise as you would love it to be. Look and focus on those extremes.
I'd like to add that it's just extremely important to not only evaluate the schedule, but, what happened during that time that each team played each team. And when you're looking at rest disadvantages, maybe the other team's on the same situation. So you really have to look a little bit more closely. I want to get you out on your hard stop. So I'm going to quick fire some questions to you. Do you feel, what do you do when the metrics of certain teams just get completely out of sight? Like last year, Arizona and New England really got kind of out of hand, and there were some bad teams that got a little out of hand the other way. How are you making those adjustments with those outliers in your metrics?
To me, it's more art than science. I don't have hard and fast rules at any point in time. Like, I'm going to cap this team at this power ranking. I'm going to cap this team from a totals perspective here. I use a lot of, there's so many data points that I now have access to that I didn't, like, even 2, 3, 4 years ago, that it's impossible to incorporate those perfectly into a model. So a lot of what I'm doing now is a blend of model with like the art and the understanding and the feel for how I'm reading the game almost through the matrix of all this data. And I try to not put artificial constraints on myself to, well, I got these rules and I got to follow these rules with my model specifically, and cap a team at X. But you're right, it does need to be done when certain teams do get way out of whack, or their injury status is just ridiculous, and you got to factor in so they play a game in 35-mile-per-hour winds. Are you going to incorporate that into your model? Are you going to get rid of it entirely? Like all these things, there's not a hard and fast rule. You just got to do what you think is best, but you can't ignore those issues.
We both had excellent success with NFL, and I'm a less is more type of guy. So I'm actually in the inverse, where I'm not looking to add things that are going to trip up what has proven successful. With that segue, what stats do you believe are not as valuable as people may believe, and what underrated stats do you value?
Well, this is good for discussion just in terms of football in general, football analysis in general. I think it's just understanding the stats that provide the highest leverage situations, like third down conversions and like red zone production or goal to go situations. Those are going to have massive results on the outcome of a game, but they are far less predictive both year over year as well as over the course of a season. What's more predictive is not how you perform inside the 10-yard line, but how good is your offense over the other 90 yards of the football field. If you've got a really good offense in general, unless your coach is really shooting himself in the foot down there, which would become a pattern like Ron looks at, and then you could identify and isolate that, you should see regression such that 10th best offense in 90 yards of the field should be close to being the 10th best offense inside goal to go situation. And if they're down at 32, why is that? And if it's a couple of random things that have happened that have tripped them up, they should be able to get back on track in the coming weeks. Things that are more important that not as many teams focus in on enough is twofold. And this is what I talk to teams when I work with them and consult with them. Third down avoidance and getting out to a lead. We both know that the number one statistic is turnover margin, right? And having the best, but that's so hard to predict. And unfortunately, far too many coaches, if they have an inexperienced quarterback, get so scared of not losing this turnover battle because they think it's going to cost them the game, that they do 10 other inefficient things over the course of the game that is going to actually compound to cause more damage to them than if they had just thrown one more interception in the game. They play so conservatively and so scared and don't want to throw the ball on first down. The biggest thing really is third down avoidance, early down efficiency, because on those, yes, more teams are going for it on fourth downs, but a lot of the time, if you fail on a third down, somebody's coming in to kick a ball, whether it's a field goal or it's a punt. And if you can avoid being in third downs completely, then you never have to run into those situations. So which teams are able to move the chains on first and second down, and defensively, which teams are able to force offenses into third downs more frequently, those are the teams that I focus in on. Those are the teams that are going to have the best success. And I think we're going to see a big switch. Well, it'll be interesting to see how it turns out into on-field success. But the New York Giants, that offense, as it was called by Jason Garrett, did not give a care in the world as if they got into third down. This team wanted to get in third and manageable, and let's convert. Let's not make Daniel Jones throw it too much on first down. We think we can win on third down. The reality is, let's have Daniel Jones throw on first down when the defense might be playing the run a little bit. Let's have Daniel Jones avoid third downs, and that's what Brian Daboll, I think, is definitely going to be focusing in on with the Giants this season. It'll be interesting to see if that actually translates with decent injury situations and decent results in one-score games, that they actually win more games. But their process is going to be far superior offensively than what it was last season.
I know Ron has a totals question here for you.
Yeah, I have one more question for you. And you've done excellent work in the past in terms of totals, but not everybody is in the totals. They're doing other things, the straights, the teases, and so on. What advice would you give for somebody who wants to get into betting NFL or even college totals? Where do you look for in terms of gaining edges?
Yeah, it's it's different. The reason I got into that is because I found the market to be softer and easier to beat. And so I focused a lot on that market. But it's not like any other market. You have to come up with for me, I'm best suited. I developed a model. And like Chris said, he doesn't tweak his or try to put in too much to it. I haven't changed my model very much, but I now incorporate whereas before I was 100% model, now I'm down to 80% model and 20% all this other data that I can find and see if that might help me in a certain situation. Mm-hmm. And the combination of those has been useful, but there's no real one well, if you're great here, you will go over the total or go under the total. It's a lot about playing the game out in your, the model gets you in the right direction, but you'll feel better about those plays when you play that game out in your mind and you get an understanding as to what the philosophy is of this particular team. And are they trying to run the ball? Are they trying to pass the ball? What's the opponent good at doing? And what is a team that's down in the second half turn to do? Do they pass the ball and are they effective or are they not? Do they only pass the ball very late in the fourth quarter and they're content to run the ball a little bit more, even though they're trailing? All these different things you try to factor into your understanding of teams, because totals actually, from my experience, do relate a lot to play calling and strategy of the coaches, as opposed to just purely, what the model is suggesting.
So you're incorporating this valuable information and what you can glean from what the coaches' game plans are going to be from week to week, and the 20% exterior factors, I think, is an awesome adjustment and important with everybody's model. You can't just stick to the model by itself. Just two last questions. What do you dislike the most about sports betting, and what do you like the most?
That's a good question. So I guess what I like the most about it is that everybody can make up their own opinion and anybody can go and move when they want to on a game. And it's easy to see if your process is going to result in you having success or not. This is not something that you'll try for a few years and you're still not sure if you're actually good at it or not. Every one of us has bad years or down years, but for the most part, if you're stacking years together, you're going to know pretty quickly if you're on the right track for something. And so it's easy to kind of dabble and try new things and immediately see, I'm wasting my time with this. I need to try that, or let me get out of this altogether. So because it's so results oriented, it does help you save some time. I think some of your valuable time in your own life. If you're not having good results, you have to change something and adapt. I guess what I dislike about it is, as it's gotten more popular, there's more people involved. And so different people are going at different times. And even I'm talking professional betting groups, I find myself, I'm rarely competing against the sports book. I'm primarily competing against other betting groups to try to beat them to the market. But there's certain games where the entry point should not be on Monday night. It should not be on Tuesday morning. And yet, because we need information, and so does everybody. It's not as if everybody knows some of this stuff. We're waiting on something. And I'm not talking about secret inside info. I'm talking about just general. The right entry point is not now. Maybe the line's going the other direction. But then these guys, these groups, they'll come in and they won't wait till the line dips down to the right number. They'll go a half a point or a point too early, in your opinion, or they're not waiting for the last bit of information that they should. They're going. And so it's a lot of competition now against these guys. It makes it fun. It makes it challenging and exciting. But that's the main thing I dislike, simply because it ends up ultimately costing me money. So, it's all about making money in betting on sports. Do you have more money than you started with? And that does cost you money when some of these guys get in and steal the number, or they're not waiting for the optimal time to time the market.
Market reading is number one for me. It's 24/7. I've contacted you in the past and wondered why you did something or somebody else did something. Last year we saw really bad, big groups betting at the wrong times. I've noticed over the last 2 years, they're from Europe. They don't understand the market, and they'll bet those Eagles or they'll bet somebody else at the wrong time. And I think it's important to network with other people and try to get on the same page, because we all have our own metrics that we're going to stick by. We don't care what the other person's betting, but we want to know when the best time to play that is. Ron, do you have a final question for Warren?
No, I don't really have a final question. I just want to thank you for your insight. I think I have a final 30 questions, because we could literally pick your brain and go on and on. There's so many topics that I know I didn't get to in terms of doing a deeper dive. But I appreciate the time that you've given us, and I'll still be gleaning some information from the different pages that you provided.
Yeah,
Warren,
I appreciate that.
Warren, we really appreciated your time. We know you're busy with NBC. We know you're busy with helping certain teams with consultations. You're heavily in demand, so appreciate your time, and wish you the best of luck this season.
Yeah, the best information I can impart is people should check out the book, because there's more there. We didn't get to everything, but there's definitely more there, and I think you guys are going to enjoy it. But really respect the work you guys both do in the process, and thanks for inviting me on, and hope people enjoy the listen.
Our pleasure, and we appreciate everybody joining us, and we'll be back next week with another guest, where we're going to do a variety of topics coming forward for the next several weeks. We really appreciate it, Warren. Cheers, everybody.